Commander Vex 9 stood at the observation deck of the Galactic Educational Summit Station, watching the small blue-green planet rotate lazily below. The third planet, from a yellow dwarf star, populated by a species that called themselves humans. Honestly, what kind of name was that? Humans. It sounded like something you'd name a pet rock. The annual summit brought together the finest educators from across the galaxy. Philosophers from Centauri Prime, mathematicians from the crystal cities of Vega 7, artists from the floating gardens of Nebula 4. And this year, for the first time ever, they had invited a representative from Earth. "Are you nervous about meeting the human?" asked Professor Kilrath, a tall, elegant being whose species had perfected the art of quantum poetry 3,000 years before humans discovered fire. Vex 9's tentacles twitched with what could generously be called amusement. Nervous? About a creature from a backwater world that only achieved faster-than-light travel last Tuesday? I think not. The human delegation was scheduled to arrive within the hour. According to the files, Earth had sent exactly one representative. One. The audacity was almost admirable. Most worlds sent delegations of at least 50 beings, complete with cultural attachés, scientific advisors, and enough bureaucrats to fill a small moon. But humans? They sent one middle-aged female named Dr. Elena Vasquez. "I hear she's some sort of instructor," Kilrath mused, adjusting his crystalline spectacles. Though the translation matrix couldn't quite parse what subject she teaches, the docking bay announcement echoed through the station. "Attention all beings, the human transport vessel Determination is now requesting docking permission." Vex 9's eye stalks rolled in, perfect synchronization. Determination? They named their ship Determination? How delightfully primitive. Within minutes, the station's social media networks were buzzing with images of the human ship. It was functional. No elegant curves like Centauri vessels, no bioluminescent patterns like vegan craft, no anti-gravity sculptures like Andromedan transports. It looked exactly like what it was, a metal tube with engines strapped to one end. "At least they made it here in one piece," Vex 9 muttered. The welcoming committee assembled in the main reception hall. Representatives from dozens of worlds stood in carefully arranged formation, each delegation more impressive than the last. The Centauri contingent wore robes that shifted color with their emotions. The vegans had brought a small orchestra that played music in dimensions most beings couldn't even perceive. The Andromedans. Well, the Andromedans were there, though nobody could see them, because they existed in a slightly different phase of reality. Then the human arrived. Dr. Elena Vasquez was, by galactic standards, utterly unremarkable. Average height for her species, brown hair pulled back in what humans called a ponytail, wearing simple dark clothing that looked suspiciously practical. She carried a single bag over one shoulder and walked with the kind of confident stride that suggested she either knew exactly where she was going or was very good at pretending she did. "Welcome, honored educator from Earth," proclaimed Chancellor Zorp Alpha, the station's administrator. His voice boomed through the translator systems in 47 different languages simultaneously. "We are deeply honored by your presence at this gathering of the galaxy's greatest minds." Elena smiled. It was a pleasant enough expression, though Vex 9 noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for having me. I have to admit, this is quite different from the last educational conference I attended." "And where was that held?" asked Professor Yilnex, a being who looked remarkably like a walking tree made of silver. "Mogadishu," Elena replied cheerfully. The translation systems worked, over time, cross-referencing databases, consulting linguistic matrices, and finally producing a series of confused beeps. "I'm sorry," Chancellor Zorp Alpha said. "Our systems are having difficulty locating this institution." "Oh, it's not an institution," Elena said, her smile widening just a fraction. "It's a city, on Earth. The conference was in a refugee camp, actually." The assembled beings exchanged glances. Refugee camp? What sort of educational conference was held in a refugee camp? How primitive, whispered someone from the back of the crowd. Elena's head tilted slightly, like a predator that had just heard something interesting. I'm sorry, did someone say something? Not at all, honored guest. Chancellor Zorp Alpha intervened quickly. Perhaps you would like to be shown to your quarters? The opening ceremony begins in 3 standard hours. As Elena was escorted away, the gathered educators began to whisper among themselves. The Zentari delegation was particularly vocal in their confusion. A refugee camp? Professor Kilrath muttered. What could she possibly teach in such a place? Probably basic arithmetic, suggested Vex 9. Or perhaps how to make fire without burning down their shelters. The laughter that followed was polite, but unmistakably condescending. 3 hours later, the Grand Assembly Hall filled with beings from across the galaxy. The hall itself was a marvel of engineering, with gravity generators allowing creatures of different gravitational needs to mingle freely, atmospheric processors maintaining dozens of different breathing mixtures, and translation systems so advanced they could convey not just words, but emotional context and cultural subtext. Chancellor Zorp Alpha took the stage, his 4 arms gesturing grandly as he welcomed the assembly. Honored educators, brilliant minds, shapers of young consciousness across the galaxy, welcome to the annual Galactic Educational Summit. The applause was thunderous, though it sounded different depending on which species was doing the applauding. The Zentari clapped with their primary hands, while their secondary arms waved in patterns that expressed approval. The vegans produced harmonic tones that resonated beautifully through the crystal structures in their bodies. The beings from Tau Ceti simply changed color. This year, the Chancellor continued, we have representatives from 137 worlds, each bringing unique perspectives on the sacred art of education. From the quantum meditation masters of Arcturus to the probability theorists of Proxima Centauri, from the emotion weavers of the Pleiades to our newest member, the representative from Earth. A spotlight fell on Elena, who was sitting in the section reserved for first-time attendees. She waved politely, which several species interpreted as a territorial dominance display. Now, Chancellor Zorp Alpha announced, let us begin with our traditional opening presentations. Each delegation will have 5 minutes to introduce themselves and their educational philosophy. What followed was 3 hours of the most sophisticated educational discourse in the known galaxy. The Zentari spoke of teaching through shared consciousness experiences. The vegans demonstrated learning through harmonic resonance. The Andromedans gave a presentation that nobody could see, but everyone agreed was probably very impressive. Finally, inevitably, it was Earth's turn. Elena stood and walked to the stage with that same confident stride. She didn't carry any notes, didn't activate a holographic display, didn't even bring a glass of water. She simply stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled beings. Hello, she said simply. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I'm from Earth. The translation systems, which had been working overtime all evening to convey complex philosophical concepts, suddenly had nothing to do. I suppose you're wondering what I teach, Elena continued. It's a fair question. I've been listening to all of you for the past 3 hours, and I have to say, your educational systems sound absolutely fascinating. There was a murmur of appreciation from the crowd. Quantum meditation, harmonic learning, probability weaving, consciousness sharing. Incredible stuff, really. The kind of advanced educational techniques that a primitive species like mine could only dream of. Vex 9's tentacles twitched. Something in the human's tone was setting off alarm bells in his predator detection system. But here's the thing, Elena said, and her voice carried a note that made every prey species in the room suddenly pay very close attention. All of your beautiful, sophisticated educational systems have one thing in common. They assume a safe, stable environment. They assume that your students have time to contemplate, to meditate, to harmonize with the universe. The room was getting quieter, much quieter. On Earth, we don't always have that luxury. Sometimes the classroom is a refugee camp. Sometimes the students are children who haven't eaten in 3 days. Sometimes the lesson has to be learned right now, this instant, or people die. Elena paused, letting that sink in. So when people ask me what I teach, I tell them I teach survival. And you know what? The room always gets very, very quiet. And indeed, the Grand Assembly Hall, which had been filled with the whispered conversations of dozens of species, had fallen completely silent. I teach survival, Elena repeated, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. Not the academic concept of survival, not the philosophical implications of survival. I teach people how to actually survive when everything goes wrong, when the systems fail, when the government collapses, when the bombs start falling, when the food runs out, when the only thing standing between your family and death is what you learned in my classroom. A being, in the vegan delegation, made a sound that the translator systems interpreted as profound discomfort. I teach 10-year-old children how to purify water using nothing but sand, charcoal, and cloth. I teach teenagers how to identify which insects are safe to eat and which will kill you. I teach mothers how to set broken bones without medical equipment, and fathers how to deliver babies without doctors. The silence was becoming oppressive. I teach people how to make antibiotics from bread mold, how to start fires in the rain, how to find north when there are no stars, how to build shelter from rubble, how to make weapons from kitchen utensils, how to stay sane when everyone around you is dying. Professor Kilrath was gripping his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Several beings had started edging toward the exits. You want to know what my teaching philosophy is? Elena asked, and there was something in her smile now that made Vex 9's survival instinct scream at him to run. It's this: hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Because in this universe, things go wrong. They go wrong a lot, and when they do, all your beautiful theories and elegant philosophies won't save you. She gestured to the assembled crowd. How many of your species have never known war? How many have never faced famine, plague, natural disaster, or societal collapse? The silence stretched on. I thought so, Elena said quietly. You've all transcended those problems, haven't you? You've built perfect societies, eliminated conflict, conquered scarcity. You've created educational systems that assume safety, stability, and unlimited resources. Her expression grew thoughtful. That's wonderful. Really. I'm not being sarcastic. I'm genuinely happy that you've managed to create worlds where survival isn't a daily concern. But here's the thing about survival skills. You don't miss them until you need them. And when you need them, it's too late to learn. Elena walked to the edge of the stage, closer to the audience. 3 months ago, I was teaching a class in South Sudan. 26 students, ages 8 to 16. We were working on water purification techniques when we heard gunfire. Rebels had entered the camp. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Within 5 minutes, my students had hidden the younger children, created concealment from classroom materials, and established escape routes. They knew what to do, because survival isn't just a subject I teach. It's a mindset. It's a way of thinking that keeps you alive when everything else fails. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the assembly. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, how barbaric, how primitive. What kind of civilization allows such conditions to exist? And you're right to think that. It is barbaric. It is primitive. But it's also reality for billions of beings across the galaxy, including many on your own worlds that you'd prefer not to think about. Vex 9 found himself leaning forward, despite himself. The difference between my students and yours, Elena continued, is that when disaster strikes, mine keep going. They adapt. They overcome. They survive. Because that's what humans do. We're not the smartest species in the galaxy. We're not the strongest, or the fastest, or the most advanced. But we're very, very hard to kill. She walked back to the podium. I was invited here because humanity recently achieved faster-than-light travel. Because we've joined the galactic community. Because you wanted to learn about our educational systems. Well, this is it. This is what we teach our children. How to survive in an uncertain universe. Elena's smile returned, but it was different now. There was something predatory about it. I teach survival, and every single one of my students is still alive. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a whisper, not a cough, not even the sound of breathing. The assembled beings stared at the small, human woman on the stage, and for the first time since they'd achieved faster-than-light travel, they began to understand exactly what kind of species they'd just welcomed into the galactic community. Elena looked out at the crowd one more time. Any questions? The silence stretched on, and on, and on. Finally, from somewhere in the back of the room, a small voice asked, "How do you make antibiotics from bread mold?" Elena's grin was sharp enough to cut glass. "Now that," she said, "is exactly the right question." Elena stepped closer to the edge of the stage, her eyes scanning the massive assembly hall. The question about antibiotics had come from a young Zentari student in the back rows, and now every being in the room was leaning forward with the kind of attention usually reserved for imminent threats. "Penicillin," Elena said simply. "Alexander Fleming discovered it by accident in 1928, though humans had been using moldy bread for wound treatment for thousands of years before that. The blue-green mold, penicillium, produces a compound that kills bacteria. You let bread get moldy, scrape off the mold, mix it with water, filter it through cloth, and you have a crude but effective antibiotic." Professor Yilnex, the tree-like being from the silver forests of Kepler 442b, raised what might have been a branch. "But surely that's extremely dangerous. Without proper purification protocols, sterilization procedures, quality control measures." Elena's laugh was short and sharp. "Dangerous? Yes. More dangerous than dying from an infected wound because you don't have access to proper medical facilities? No." She walked to the center of the stage, her hands clasped behind her back. "You see, that's the fundamental difference between academic learning and survival education. In academia, you get to optimize for the best possible outcome. In survival situations, you optimize for any outcome that doesn't involve death." Vex 9 found his vocal cords producing its sounds without his permission. "But surely your species has moved beyond such crude methods? Have we?" Elena asked, tilting her head. "Commander, what happens on your homeworld when the power grid fails?" "Our power grids don't fail," Vex 9 replied automatically. "We have 17 redundant systems and quantum backup generators that, what happens when they all fail?" Elena interrupted gently. The silence that followed was telling. "On Earth," Elena continued, "we plan for system failures because systems always fail eventually. It's not pessimism, it's physics. Entropy increases, complexity breeds failure points, and Murphy's Law is apparently universal." Chancellor Zorp Alpha stepped forward, his forearms gesturing diplomatically. "Honored guest, while your practical approach is certainly interesting, surely you must agree that education should inspire beings to reach for higher ideals? To transcend base survival instincts?" Elena's smile was patient in the way that made predators nervous. "Chancellor, let me ask you something. How long has your civilization been spacefaring?" "Approximately 12,000 standard years," Zorp Alpha replied proudly. "And in all that time, has your species ever faced an existential crisis? A moment where everything you'd built was threatened?" The Chancellor's confident posture wavered slightly. "Well, there was the Great Convergence War, approximately 4,000 years ago. How did you survive it? Our military forces, advanced technology, strategic alliances." "Your survival instincts," Elena corrected. dressed up in fancy language, but survival instincts nonetheless. The ability to identify threats, adapt to changing circumstances, make hard decisions under pressure, and keep fighting when everything looked hopeless. She gestured to the assembled crowd. Every single species in this room exists because your ancestors were survivors. They faced predators, natural disasters, resource scarcity, hostile environments, and other species trying to kill them. They survived, adapted, and thrived. But somewhere along the way, you convinced yourselves that survival was beneath you. A being from the Rigel system, who looked like a walking crystal formation, spoke up in harmonics that the translators rendered as mild confusion. Are you suggesting that advanced civilizations should abandon progress in favor of primitive survival techniques? Not at all, Elena replied. I'm suggesting that survival skills are the foundation that makes everything else possible. You can't have advanced mathematics if your mathematicians starve to death. You can't have beautiful art if your artists die in the first natural disaster. You can't explore the cosmos if you can't handle basic resource management. She pulled out a small device from her pocket, something that looked deceptively simple. This is a water purification tablet. Chemical composition is nothing special. Any decent chemistry lab could synthesize it. But do you know why it exists? The assembled beings waited. Because clean water is the difference between civilization and collapse. And sometimes, the difference between those two things is a small tablet that costs less than a cup of coffee. Professor Kilrath's crystalline spectacles were practically vibrating with intellectual discomfort. But surely, with our advanced technology, such primitive concerns are irrelevant? Elena's expression grew thoughtful. 3 weeks ago, I received a communication from the Vegan High Council. Every being in the vegan delegation suddenly looked extremely uncomfortable. Apparently, there was some sort of cascading failure in their atmospheric processing systems. Nothing catastrophic, mind you. Just enough to reduce efficiency by 30%. They wanted to know if humans had any alternative atmospheric management techniques that didn't require advanced technology. The lead vegan representative, whose bioluminescent patterns had shifted to what the translators identified as acute embarrassment, spoke in tones barely above a whisper. The consultation was strictly precautionary. Of course it was, Elena said kindly. And the techniques I shared with them, breathing exercises to increase oxygen efficiency, were developed by humans living at high altitudes where the air is naturally thin. Nothing advanced, nothing sophisticated, just survival adaptations that became cultural knowledge. She turned back to the broader assembly. The funny thing about survival skills is that they scale. The same principles that help an individual survive in the wilderness, help communities survive disasters, nations survive wars, and civilizations survive existential threats. Elena walked over to a control panel and activated the hall's holographic display system. Instead of showing complex equations or artistic presentations, she projected a simple image, Earth. This is my homeworld, she said, currently home to about 8 billion humans. We've been through ice ages, supervolcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, plagues that killed half our population, and wars that should have ended our species. We're still here. The image zoomed in to show various regions of the planet. We live in deserts where the temperature reaches 70 degrees Celsius. We live in frozen wastelands where it drops to -50. We live on mountains where the air is too thin to breathe, in swamps filled with diseases, on islands that regularly disappear underwater during storms. Each location appeared on the display as she spoke. We live in cities built on fault lines, knowing they could be destroyed by earthquakes. We build communities in the paths of hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods. We establish settlements in places where the local wildlife could kill us, the plants are poisonous, and the water needs to be treated before we can drink it. The assembled beings were staring at the display, with something approaching horror. Why? Asked someone from the audience. Why would any rational species choose to live in such conditions? Elena's grin was fierce and proud. Because we can. Because survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about thriving in conditions that would kill anyone else. It's about looking at a hostile environment and saying, "I bet I can make this work." She gestured to the display. Every one of these settlements started the same way. Someone looked at an impossible situation and decided to survive it. And once they survived it, they figured out how to make it better. And then they taught their children how to do the same thing. The image shifted to show human cities, gleaming and advanced, built in those same hostile environments. That's what I teach. Not just how to survive the immediate crisis, but how to build something better from the wreckage. How to look at failure and see opportunity. How to turn disadvantages into strengths. Elena turned off the display and faced the assembly directly. You want to know the real difference between human education and yours? When we teach children about history, we don't just tell them about the victories. We teach them about the disasters, the failures, the times when everything went wrong. And then we teach them how people survived those disasters and built something better. She paused, letting that sink in. When the Andromedan plague hit the outer colonies last year, who did the Galactic Health Organization call for consultation? The question hung in the air like a challenge. They called humans, Elena continued. Not because we had the most advanced medical technology. You all had us beat by centuries on that front. They called us because we were the only species with a comprehensive database of plague survival strategies. Because when diseases hit human populations, we don't just treat the illness. We document everything. We study what worked, what didn't work, and why. We turn every disaster into a learning experience. A small voice from the student section asked, "But doesn't that make you sad? Always preparing for the worst?" Elena's expression softened slightly. You know what makes me sad? Getting a message from a colony world asking for help because their automated systems failed and nobody knows how to grow food without them. Or hearing about a species that went extinct because they couldn't adapt when their homeworld's climate changed. She walked closer to the student section. Preparing for the worst doesn't make us pessimistic. It makes us optimistic. Because when you know you can survive anything, you're free to try anything. When you're not afraid of failure, you can take the risks that lead to real breakthroughs. Elena pulled out another small device, this one looking like a simple metal tube. This is a water filter, made from sand, charcoal, and cloth. It can process contaminated water into something safe to drink. The materials cost about 2 credits, and anyone can build one. She held up a second device. This one clearly advanced technology with glowing panels and intricate designs. This is a molecular purification system from Centauri Prime. It can process any liquid into perfectly pure water. It costs about 20,000 credits and requires a certified technician to operate. The contrast was stark. Both devices do the same job, Elena said. But which one works when the power goes out? Which one works when you don't have 20,000 credits? Which one works when the certified technician isn't available? She placed both devices on the podium. Advanced technology is wonderful. It makes life easier, safer, more comfortable. But it's not a replacement for basic knowledge. It's a supplement to it. Professor Yilnex raised his branch-like appendage again. Are you suggesting that we should abandon technological advancement? I'm suggesting you should understand what happens when it's not available, Elena replied, because sooner or later, it won't be. Systems fail, technology breaks, resources run out, and when that happens, the species that survive are the ones who remember how to function without it. She turned to face the entire assembly. 3 days ago, I was contacted by the Kepler Colony Administration. Beautiful world, perfect climate, abundant resources, population of 12 million beings from 47 different species. Elena paused for effect. They wanted to know if humans had any advice for dealing with, and I quote, temporary resource allocation challenges. The translation systems worked overtime to parse the euphemism. "They were starving," Elena said bluntly. Their automated food distribution system had developed a glitch. Nothing major, just a software bug that caused delivery delays. But apparently, nobody on the entire colony knew how to grow, hunt, fish, or otherwise obtain food without the automated systems. The silence in the room was deafening. 12 million beings, representing some of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, and they were 3 days away from famine because of a software bug. Elena's voice carried a mix of sadness and frustration. "We sent a team of human instructors, not scientists, not engineers, not diplomats, instructors, people who teach survival skills to children. Within a week, they had established food production systems that could keep the colony fed indefinitely, using nothing but local resources and basic knowledge." She looked out at the assembled beings, her gaze steady and unwavering. "That's what I teach. Not just survival, but independence, self-reliance, the knowledge that no matter what goes wrong, you have options. You have skills. You have the ability to adapt and overcome." Elena walked back to the podium and picked up her simple bag. "You asked me what I teach, and I told you. Survival. But maybe that's not the right word. Maybe what I really teach, island. Confidence. The confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever life throws at you." She slung the bag over her shoulder and smiled at the assembly. "Because in the end, that's what education should do. It should prepare you for the world as it is, not as you wish it were. And the world, this universe, is a dangerous, unpredictable place where things go wrong and systems fail. And the only thing you can really count on is your ability to adapt." Elena started walking toward the exit, then stopped and turned back to the assembly. "Oh, and for those of you taking notes, the bread mold technique works best with whole grain bread. White bread doesn't develop the right kind of mold. Also, you need to test it on a small area first to make sure you're not allergic." She paused at the exit. "Any other questions?" The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Chancellor Zorp Alpha found his voice. "Dr. Vasquez, would you consider? That is, would it be possible? Could you perhaps conduct some workshops while you're here?" Elena's smile lit up the entire room. "Chancellor, I thought you'd never ask. First lesson starts in 1 hour. Topic: Basic first aid using improvised materials. Bring something to take notes with, and dress comfortably. We'll be practicing on each other." As she left the hall, the assembled beings sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Then, slowly, they began to move. Some headed for the exits, clearly overwhelmed by what they'd heard. Others pulled out communication devices, frantically contacting their home worlds. But most of them, the vast majority, began making their way toward the workshop areas, because Elena Vasquez had taught them something that day, not just about survival, but about themselves, about the gaps in their perfect educational systems, about the assumptions they'd made regarding safety and stability, and most importantly, she'd taught them that the small, unremarkable human from the backwater world might just have the most important knowledge in the galaxy. After all, they were all survivors' descendants. Maybe it was time they remembered how to survive.